Yeah, the other night, when I was at that meeting and I got, this angry response kind of from the group, talking about, co-ed bathrooms and all that stuff. Anyway, what I was started out trying to explain is something I didn't do a very good job explaining, obviously, because there wasn't full understanding, and I knew that. But I was talking about, good things and bad things. There's things that we need to change within this, transgender movement in order to actually get it there. Within education, we're teaching that gender and sex are two separate things. So there's separate things in everyone. Even if you're cisgender, it's still separate. And, so for treatments that work for me because I'm transgender to bring those two things into alignment, if we were to give those same treatments to a cisgender person, it would bring them out of alignment, and we would create a transgender person. So we know that sex and gender are two separate things in everyone. Within education, that's what we're teaching. Within the medical and mental health community, even though we need to get them up to speed, and I'm going to talk about that, even though they really need to get up to speed fast, that basic concept is known, that gender and sex are two separate things. And that's what creates the possibility for a transgender person to be born into this world. If sex and gender were the same thing, as we're using them in legislation, and I'll get to that, then there would be no transgender people. The entire premise, the entire argument, is based on the fact that your gender and your sex are separate things. And so then we've got this agreement within education and medication, but then we completely run off the reservation when we're talking about legislation. And, we're saying sex and gender are separate things, but then legislation is being passed using the cisgender definitions of gender and sex, and they just interchange them whenever they feel like it. The lawyer's job is to win the case. And, California was really the first one to really start creating and passing legislations. And, while they were doing that, I was talking to some people that were out there, and I said, it's great that you're getting things moving, but I have to point out, if you continue going down that road with the arguments that you're using, eventually it's going to come back to bite you. And the laws that we have here set up now in New York State are really a mimic of the California laws. And it's why in both states we have laws that allowed me to change my M to an F on my ID, but the law states that I can change my gender marker. And there's no such thing as a gender marker. But that's how they got it through the court. That's how they won their case. They said, okay. But there is no such thing as a gender marker. It says sex in our ID. And so then, I could have changed my M to an F 2.5 years ago when the law first came out. But I was pushing back. I was trying to explain to him that, guys, it's wonderful that you did this, but if you continue down the road doing this continually, it's going to bite you in the ass. And, now we kind of see it is. That ruling, the Chicago ruling, the Illinois ruling that came down from the Department of Education around Title IX, stating that sex and gender are the same thing, so this applies to transgender people, go for it, was again an incorrect ruling, and it was based on that same argument that the lawyers have been doing over and over and over again. Well, since that ruling came down, pretty much everybody in the LGBT just kind of lined up behind it. We're going to follow that. And there was a sense of momentum after that happened, but it was, you hit a brick wall pretty quick. I haven't seen a lot of positive things come out of that ruling. It's not like schools have been implementing what that ruling was stating they had to implement. There isn't widespread, policy changes in our schools. Some schools are making changes, but they're making them on their own. And they're not adhering to that Title IX ruling. Because that portion of it with naked children, that's where it kind of runs off the tracks. And you can't state that sex and gender are the same thing. But anyway, people are starting to catch up. And that's what I was saying before to other groups and to lawyers and to senators and to different people. I said eventually people are going to get wise to this. And they're going to start understanding because we are doing education. And through education, they're going to understand. Now, I hate to say that the Trump administration did anything right whatsoever. But obviously somebody within that administration did enough research or had a great enough understanding to understand that sex and gender are two different things. And so that's why they threw aside the Title IX thing. They said, well, that doesn't make any sense. We're not even going to deal with it. Now, they threw it under the bus, the administration, because they're dicks. But they were actually correct in throwing that aside. Now, I'm really hoping that the LGBT community does not try to take up that, Title IX, sex and gender are the same thing, and start running with it again. Because, if you do, you're not going to get anywhere at this point. And really, we've come to a point within our arguments that are going to have to be not based on, well, nobody knows anything anyway, so maybe we can slip it past them. Which is what we've been doing, kind of. By using the gentler word gender in replacement for sex. You won a couple court battles by doing that, but it's not actually correct. They have two different meanings, two different definitions. But yet you're still trying to use them synonymously, continuously, which just creates issues in other areas. Now, the other thing I was talking about is the level of acceptance. Here in New York State and other places, I know that the acceptance level, even if it's blind acceptance, they don't understand the whys or the meaning of what it is to be transgender, but there's some blind acceptance. Now, in my day-to-day life, it's enjoyable to have that blind acceptance. Just to give an example, the other day I'm switching my my phone and internet from cable to a phone company, and then that phone company, when I was talking to them, they said we have to do a credit check. I was like, all right, and so she said, what's the name on your ID? And I said, Erica Elizabeth Ravenwood. And so she ran the check, and she's like, cool, it came back and you're fine. And then I got a call a few days later, and it was somebody else, and they said, we have to do a identity verification. And I knew why. The reason being is that in the system, Erica Elizabeth Ravenwood has only existed for a very short time legally. And so that's why. So rather than having them send the form and do all that, stuff that would take days, I said, well, let's just resolve it now. I know what the issue is. I said, I'm transgender. I did a name change, and my the sex of my ID is no longer M, it's F. So that's why you're not finding me as kind of an existing person. And that's exactly what it was. But she was, it goes into that acceptance thing, because she wasn't shocked, she wasn't blown away, she wasn't, surprised, she wasn't, anything. It was just, oh, awesome, we can fix this now. And I find that more and more often, so that part of the acceptance thing is great. The part that isn't so great is I find blind acceptance within our medical and mental health communities as well. Several years ago, I started giving them warnings. I said, look, guys, you're going to have to get ready for this flood that's coming. Because as we do education, we reduce fear. Here in America, in the United States, you're going to get this flood of people seeking treatment. And not enough of you know what the hell you're doing. And that's what we're finding. And California did the same thing that we did here in New York, was kind of make it easier to seek treatment, which isn't a bad thing. But by doing that, in order to do that, because the experts were very few and far between, people that actually understand what transgender is and can do a proper diagnosis so that they can give you that letter and it's responsible. Those are all few and far between. But now here in New York State, anybody can give you that letter. It doesn't matter. Any medical practitioner, GP, physician assistant, any therapist, with no training can give you that letter. And I see it often. Hear about it often. And it happened to me when I came out the second time to my psychiatrist, my current psychiatrist at that time. I came out as transgender, and she said, "Okay, what do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, I want to transition. I want to start hormones." And there wasn't any questions, none, which is great from the standpoint of convenience. And I know that I'm transgender, so for me there's no question. But she never asked me any questions, and it's like, and in talking to her after the fact, I found she really didn't know anything about transgender anyway. She was assuming that the misconceptions that we're trying to dispel now is the idea of what transgender was to her anyway. One of the reasons I left her. But I have yet, and I've seen a lot of therapists, I have yet to sit down with a therapist who really knew anything about transgender prior to meeting me. And I find that is an issue a lot of people here in the U.S. that are going through transition are having. That they get to the doctor and they find that they have to be the expert. And they get to their therapist and find that they have to do their own diagnosis. And that therapist is just going to take their word for it. So, the acceptance that we're feeling in our day-to-day lives, that blind acceptance, which is enjoyable, is not the greatest thing when you're going to seek treatment. And, they're relying on the patient at that point to make a proper diagnosis. And, God help them that it's correct, But as a result, we're seeing an uptick in people that are detransitioning, which I just can't even imagine. Some of these people are people that have gone through the full medical thing, had their genitals all moved around, and now they come to that realization, oh shit, I made a serious mistake here. And they're detransitioning. But that's going to happen when we're allowing people to send you down that medical path who have had no training themselves, have no understanding themselves. And so that's the situation that we've brought ourselves to. Now that situation can be resolved, but it's only going to be resolved through education. And we need to see this as a real need, that needs to be addressed now. It's not something that can wait too long. Otherwise, we're going to see more misdiagnosis happen. Whether it's diagnosis given to the patient by the therapist who is not trained to do that, or they're actually just relying on that patient to make their own diagnosis. Because with that acceptance, even in the medical and mental health communities, people are kind of afraid to say anything. They don't want to question it. And if you walk into the office and say you're transgender, okay, you're transgender. But any of us that have visited chat rooms know how many confused people come in that chat room. And, it's well and good, and it's great to be able to go through that easier system. If you yourself are sure that you're transgender and it's not a mistake for you to go down that medical path. But not everybody does. People are questioning. That's why we added the Q. Because people are questioning, and they're confused. And so to take that patient who walks into your office and they say they're transgender, and then treat them with blind acceptance, because you yourself don't know how to diagnose, but yet you have the power to give that letter that sends them on the medical path, that's problematic. And I hope people understand and see that that's problematic. And so we really do need to get deep and dirty into the education. And it's very simple. It doesn't have to be complicated. Just if they understand the basic, that your gender and your sex are two different things, and that everybody has an orientation, everybody, adopts a self-expression. That's the basic. And if you can understand that, then you can start making determinations of whether or not that person is transgender, and whether or not that medical path is the right one for them. Now, over in Great Britain, in the UK, they use the standard of care. They use it more so than we do here. Quite honestly, if you were to go to most people within the medical profession or the mental health profession and mention the standard of care, they're going to ask you what that is, because they've never heard of it. Over in the UK, though, if you were to go through the National Health Service, they only use the standard of care. And the standard of care is something that came out and is used worldwide, just kind of as the standard. And it came out after Christine Jorgensen had the first surgery. Through the 60s and 70s, they kind of established the standard of care, because people were starting to trickle out and have the surgery. But the standard of care is really a one-size-fits-all, so it addresses a slice of the transgender population. But that one-size-fits-all does not always fit everybody. If it's a correct path for you, it's actually not a bad system. It's set up so that you're making a good decision for yourself. That's the way it was set up. But if that single type of treatment plan doesn't fit you, then it's really not very good for you. And so I've talked to 3 people that have gone through the National Health Service and were kicked out of the program because that one-size-fits-all standard of care didn't fit them. And so within their system, if you don't fit our one-size-fits-all, then you have to go away altogether. We're just not going to give you any kind of treatment whatsoever. And, people get kicked out of the program. I believe it's the same in Canada. So here in the U.S., even though we are babes in the woods, as a general population around this topic, it really gives us an opportunity, if we take it, to set up something better than what they have in the UK or in Canada. And that is, a tailored approach, a more tailored approach. The standard of care also, the goal of the standard of care was seamless integration, which really means stealth. And the goal was to just seamlessly integrate, and nobody would ever know you were transgender. Which again works for some, works for a slice. I've talked to other people that tried to do that, and it was not the greatest thing for them. But now we're moving into, because we're getting this higher degree of acceptance, even if it is blind acceptance. More people like myself don't care that people know they're transgender. I just assume everybody on this planet knows I'm transgender. And I'm not afraid to talk about it. It's not something I'm afraid of, people knowing I'm transgender. And so that idea of strictly seamless integration is something that people are realizing is not needed for everyone. And so that opens the possibility for other treatments. And, so orchiectomies, it should be covered by insurance. Just like SRS is covered through Medicare and some other insurance options. But the insurance companies need to see the other treatments as options as well. And then you can tailor the treatment plan to the individual as it should be. But yeah, education. It's really a three-legged stool. You got medication, education, and legislation. And all 3 of these need to be on the same page. We need to be using the same definitions of sex and gender each time. And we can't be doing it in 2. And then over in legislation, we're just doing something completely different. Because it does catch up to you after a while. And we're seeing now that it is. It's not too late to fix it, though. It really isn't. It doesn't mean that we can't achieve the goals. It's just that we don't have to achieve the goals by tricking people, because and taking advantage of the fact that they're confused around a topic that they now see as confusing. But once they're educated, they won't see it as confusing at all, because it's really quite simple. But we really need to do it, and it doesn't require you to be transgender to do the training. It just requires somebody who understands and is able to teach. So a cisgender person can teach the transgender portion, but as long as they understand it. The reason that I got into creating the website and writing the book and creating all the training stuff that I've done and talking about all these different aspects is because my first introduction to training was something I received, and it came down from the Gay Alliance of Rochester, and it was given to, that's kind of what people are using. And I found it so inadequate. The entire audience did. It was inadequate, it was ineffective, and the audience was as confused or more so after that training portion was given than beforehand. And so I got into doing this stuff. Unfortunately, that same information, that same training material is still out there and still being used. So you still have a whole lot of confused people. And particularly if they're addressing people that will be working with transgender people, and this is the information they're given. Well, we got to kind of get away from that. We need to give better education. Education is awesome, but only if it's good education. And there was a woman at the meeting that made a very good point that we often make the mistake of I set up and I addressed this group once, and now I think I'm done. And it's not like that. Education is something that you have to repeat and repeat and repeat. You can't always guarantee that a first time through somebody's going to grasp. And you can't guarantee that a first time through somebody's even going to remember. But if we repeat these things, that's how people learn. And so we really need to just jump on this. This is an important thing, guys. That education aspect. If you do the education aspect, you're going to create true change, because you're going to create greater understanding. And it's wonderful to have blind acceptance, but wouldn't it be fun if people actually understood? And then, of course, when you have people that actually understand, then it's easier to pass legislation anyway, because you have more support. You have support outside the LGBT, outside the transgender circle. And that's what we need anyway. We need that support of the general population. And if we have that, then the legislations are easier to pass because people aren't afraid of them anymore. But they have to make sense. And they have to be consistent. You can't use the word sex and gender differently every time you do it. It doesn't work well, because it does create issues. Words and definitions are a big part of courtroom arguments and creating legislation. And we're just not doing a very good job with the transgender piece of it in that area. We're doing fine over in education. We're doing pretty good in the medical and mental health, but more training is needed because this flood of people that came out. And the reason there was this flood, and the reason we knew there was going to be this flood, is because, a few years ago, actually several years ago, I think it was the Williams Institute, did, the last greatest survey, and prior to the one that happened late 2015, which I still haven't seen any numbers for. But that Williams Institute percentage was only 0.5% of the U.S. population. 700,000 people. I mean, that's nothing. And so, I knew that the population in the U.S. is about the same as it is everywhere else in the world, around 5 or 6%. And so I knew that as we did education, as we started moving forward, and people started losing their fear, a ton of people were going to come out of the closet, because obviously we had a more highly closeted population than other parts of the world. And that levee broke. And people were seeking treatment, and they were going to anybody. Anybody they can get to. But that person they're getting to, while they have the power to send you down that medical path, they may not have the knowledge to do a proper diagnosis to help everyone. And, even, just those few people that get misdiagnosed, again, that detransitioning just sounds like a horrific thing. I mean, that's life-altering. And thankfully, the people that are doing this, even when they're speaking, I'm seeing them, they're not coming out as we've had others in the past, stating that, SRS is bullshit and there's no such thing as transgender people because look what happened to me. Well, I'm sorry you had a misdiagnosis, and I'm sorry that you went down a path you probably shouldn't have. But, I'm not hearing that from these other ones, which is thank you. That's helpful. You understand that it wasn't right for you, but you're not stating that it just doesn't exist, which is extremely helpful. Thank you. But, it really, we have to take it seriously. And we have to recognize that, a misdiagnosis like that, whether it's that diagnosis made by the patient or whether that diagnosis is made by an untrained therapist, either way, it's a tragic thing. It's not a little thing. It is very tragic. So we need to get that education into all areas, but we need to get that education into the medical and mental health sectors, who are now seeing transgender patients for the first times in their career. And so we need to really help them understand. And a lot of them want to understand. They really do. But there's not enough of us out here trying to do the education. And so we really need to kind of raise an army. But with that basic understanding of gender and sex are two separate things, and go from there. Give everybody that basic understanding, and then you as a individual transgender person with your own individual whatevers, then you can explain that, but then the person you're talking to has a foundation of knowledge to go from. That's not something we have right now. And, the whole idea from, I hate it when I hear from the transgender community, we've done all the education. Well, if that's true, then you really did a shitty job. But I know that it's not true. A lot of the education is targeted on the internet, and it's only going to be seen if somebody is interested. But what we need to do is go out into the world, and whether or not they're interested, they need to be educated. Some of these people. And that's what it requires. And it's going to really take an army to do this. And I know that we need to see that as a primary goal. It's fun to get angry and fight. It's fun to get pissed off. It's not always fun to do the education, which may resolve the fight before it starts, or at least give more clear arguments that can, that are consistent and hold up from one court case to the next. Right now it's just not like that. There's discrepancies, and there's things that are incorrect within the limited legislation that we have, and we need to just kind of get away from that. So again, I'm really hoping that the LGBT does not try to pick up that Chicago Title IX ruling, the Illinois ruling, from the Department of Education. I'm hoping that they don't pick that up again, because it was an incorrect ruling to begin with. And, it's not to say that transgender people shouldn't use restrooms according to their gender. They should. And that really has been the goal for most of us. And then you start talking about it, and then you get into this co-ed conversation. Well, that's not what people want. That's not what most transgender people wanted. What we want is to be able to live according to our gender in every aspect of our life. Because when we don't, when we're forced not to, then that heightens or just aggravates the gender dysphoria, something that you don't need. And so that's kind of the thing. I use the women's restroom because that's where I'm comfortable. And, it took me a long time to get to that point. And, prior to, I always avoided the restroom because I never liked the men's room. To me it's a scary, I don't want to be around all those guys. And so I would just avoid, avoid. And now I've gotten to a point where I don't have to avoid. I go to the women's room. That's where I'm supposed to be. And these things can be done. The only overstepping of that Title IX ruling is when we got to naked kids. And that's why it was incorrect. Because when they said that sex and gender are the same thing, so go ahead and use the gender equality law to do everything. It can be used in a lot of aspects as far as activities. You should have this, the right to participate in things, regardless of whether they're historically segregated to males or females. But that was a law that was passed for women's rights, equality. And portions of that can be used. That philosophy can be translated to school policy and other areas. But when you get down to the naked part, sex and gender are not the same things. So that's where it becomes problematic. Because now if the student has not had surgery, but you're stating by federal law, federal decision, that that kid needs to go over into a shower with people of the opposite sex at this point, that's just wrong. It's a bad decision. It places kids in danger. Whether it be the transgender student or other students, it's not a good situation to put kids in. Even if the child wants it, occasionally as responsible adults, we have to say no to kids. That's what makes us responsible adults, because we're looking out for their best interests, and we're looking out for their safety, and it's just that portion where it was an overstepping. And because they overstepped so much, and because they misunderstood, they created a firestorm that didn't need to happen. Now, one good thing that really came out of this, and it was an unexpected positive, is that the people in North Carolina, even though their legislators put together HB 2, that pushback now from the general population, it really is the general population saying, get rid of that thing. We don't want it here anymore. It brought the conversation to the forefront in North Carolina. And it has been. It's been a topic of conversation since that law came out. So it's been a topic of conversation for quite some time. And through that topic of conversation, I bet the people of North Carolina are probably the best educated general population of any of the 50 states. Now they're trying to pass the same basic law in Texas. And I'm not so sure of that positive outcome. Even if the same strategies were applied to put pressure on the state, I'm not sure that Texas would have that positive outcome that North Carolina is starting to find, as far as becoming more aware and more educated, more self-educated around this topic. Because we kind of threw it, that HB 2 threw it on people's plates, and it became dinner table conversation. It was the same thing I was talking about in dinner table conversation. It became dinner table conversation in North Carolina. So that's why the people of North Carolina have a greater degree of awareness throughout the general population than probably any other place in the United States. But it doesn't mean that we have to keep making the same mistakes. And it doesn't mean that we have to keep setting firestorms. We can move on from here with different arguments, with better arguments that actually stand up for a longer time and that are consistent with everything else. And so if you have those type of arguments in court that stand up time after time and aren't going to be found out as, hey, you tricked us, those are better arguments. And, it's always better to argue with the truth than it is, kind of a twisting of words. But anyway, education, education, education. Education is the keystone to all of this, because legislation will give you not even acceptance, but it's going to give you legislated tolerance, and so the person that would bop you on the head prior to that legislation still wants to bop you on the head. It's just that legislation is telling them that they're going to get penalized if they do. But they still want to bop you on the head. And the only way to resolve that and create that social change, again, is through education. When people understand things, they lose their fear. And, within the transgender piece, it's not like the LGBT piece or the piece around sexuality. As long as you're old enough to have heard the birds and the bees, people know what sexuality is. They know what intercourse is. There's not a whole lot of education that has to go on around that. And so the only path that the LGBT had was one of trying to gain acceptance. It's not that people don't understand what intercourse is, it's just whether or not they accept it. And so that was really the only option, and it's been a long slog over many decades to kind of get where we're at, but there's a lot of progress made. Coming out as gay isn't as shocking as it was 30 years ago, or 40 years ago. So the progress has been made in that area, but it's just around acceptance, because there's no real education that needs to go into it. But the transgender topic, there's a lot of education that needs to go into it, because it doesn't matter whether people identify as LGB or straight or cisgender or whatever. They're all kind of clueless. And so this wonderful education that I've heard about from angry people who just want to go get angry and fight, it just hasn't happened. And so that we need to fix. We just need to fix that. And so that we can have proper diagnosis, and we don't have mistakes being made, and we don't have people, trying to detransition because it wasn't done properly. And we need to, it's through education that the insurance companies are going to realize that treatments other than SRS need to be covered, and SRS needs to be covered. But all these treatments are needed treatments. But it's only through education we're going to do that. Particularly under this administration. We've got 4 years with these people, unless, something good happens. But, so don't expect any help from this administration. Just, get that in your head, that you're not going to get any help from this administration. But that's all right, because, they've relegated it down to states. Well, that's really no different than what it was before anyway. So, we just go back to dealing with our states. But when we're doing it, we have to view the United States as a complete unit as well. And you can't be doing things that are completely different in one state and expect it to match up. There has to be some sense of consistency. And so it's through that education that you're going to get that consistency, because everybody's kind of on the same basic page of what is transgender. There's another point that I just want to ask the question. What is the legal definition of transgender? What is the legal definition of transgender? And you're not going to be able to give me an answer because there isn't one. So when we pass legislation that says transgender people can, who does that apply to? What does that mean? Under the umbrella term, the old umbrella term that we've really gotten away from, the umbrella term was any gender variance. And so it was really a word without a true definition. But we have been moving forward with the presumed definition of this is transgender. But we make those assumptions. But within any of these legislations, I never see anything spelled out as to this is what we mean by transgender within this piece of legislation. So some of these things have to be considered. And, just we need to move forward more intelligently. It's concerning to me that everybody fell in line behind the Illinois Title IX decision. Because when you think about it, I hope you would see the flaw in that. But yet everybody just fell in line. I'm supporting because it has an LGBT logo on it. But everybody just kind of fell in line. And, that's unfortunate because it was so obvious that it was an incorrect decision. It was so obvious that if you're saying that sex and gender are the exact same thing, so go for it, then obviously you don't know what it is to be transgender. So you probably shouldn't be making those decisions. That was something that even the Trump administration or the Obama administration never actually came to as far as an understanding. I was sending them all kinds of teaching stuff, but there was nothing ever stated as far as an understanding. I think that they just kind of wanted to get through, make some acknowledgments that, hey, we know you're there, which is nice because it's the first time in history. But as far as that truly understanding, I didn't see a whole lot of desire to educate. We're just going to blindly accept without understanding. But people that are creating legislations, you have to understand. You have to understand what it is. People that are within the treatment, I'm sorry, you have to understand. You can't just treat somebody without knowing what it is. So these things need to be corrected. And again, we're just going to do it through education. And I'm just going to keep saying the same thing over and over again, so I'm going to say bye.